The United States has a storied and sometimes grisly history. And if horror movies have taught us anything, it's that places with a lot of history are bound to spawn some truly freaky ghost stories. Some of these ghosts have been spotted so frequently over the years, they've graduated from mere campfire tales to full-blown haunted legends. Today, we're digging up the most famous ghosts in the United States. But before we cry boo, why not subscribe to the Weird History YouTube channel? Then let us know in the comments below what other spooky stories you want to hear about. For now, the ghosts of the past are calling. If you dare. On January 23, 1897, a young boy went to a home in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, intent on doing chores. What he found instead was the body of the newly married Elva Zona Heister at the bottom of the staircase. So, does he still get paid for the day? Authorities, and more suspiciously, Zona's husband Edward S. Shue, insisted she had succumbed to a heart attack during childbirth, and that an autopsy was not necessary. What's more, Shue dressed Zona in clothes that covered just about every inch of her body, including her neck, which was wrapped with a scarf. Eventually, Zona's mother, Mary Jane, caught on that Shue's previous wife had also passed away under mysterious circumstances. But the real gotcha moment came after Elva Zona Heister's spirit visited her mother and told her flat out that Edward had murdered her. Mary Jane convinced the prosecutor to reopen the case and exhume Heister's body for a proper autopsy. The medical examiners discovered that Zona's windpipe had been crushed and her neck was broken, symptoms which are generally not the result of childbirth and are more commonly found in people who have been strangled by their husbands. Shue was arrested and spent the rest of his life in prison. He holds the distinction of being the only case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. Pawleys Island in South Carolina is a summer resort town, as beautiful as it is dangerous, due to its particular vulnerability to storms. Lucky for them, the island is home to a helpful specter, just dying to warn them of any upcoming storms. Legend says that an apparition known as the Gray Man has appeared prior to every major hurricane that has hit the island for the past 200 years. The origin of this pearlescent poltergeist involves a young woman who was waiting for her fiancé to return home. While taking a shortcut back, her love ran his horse right through a patch of quicksand where they both sank, like a scene right out of the Never-Ending Story. The young woman was heartbroken and claimed that one day, while walking on the beach, a figure that appeared to be her fiancé told her she was in danger and to leave the island. She obeyed, and that night, a storm hit the coast, destroying most of the homes except for hers. Since that day, locals say this friendly gray man continues to warn others of impending storms, because no one has the heart to tell him. We all have a weather app on our smartphones. The story of Resurrection Mary takes place in Chicago, a city with no shortage of spooky happenings and dark occurrences. The ghost of Resurrection Mary is believed to be that of a young woman from 1920 who was walking home from a party when she was fatally struck in a hit-and-run accident. Imagine how unlucky you had to be to get hit by one of the 8 cars on the road in 1920. Ever since, countless people have reported seeing her ghost along Archer Avenue in Willow Springs, about 30 minutes outside of the Windy City. Legend claims that late at night, Mary walks along the road in her white gown, asking strangers for rides. The name Resurrection Mary stems from the Resurrection Cemetery near where she is believed to have died and been buried, and where her spirit often asks to be dropped off. Those who claim to have picked her up say she vanishes into thin air before reaching her destination, just when the subject of gas money is about to come up. If wandering strange roads isn't your bag, some say you can also catch Mary's ghost in local nightclubs and share a dance with her before taking notice of her freezing cold hands, at which point she allegedly disappears, which caused many to refer to her as Cold Hands with a Warm Heart. The RMS Queen Mary was once the greatest cruise ship ever built, but now spends its days as a local haunt for all the local haunters. Since 1967, the massive ship has been permanently docked in Long Beach, California. Officially, 49 deaths occurred on board, and scary occurrences have been reported all over the ship from stem to stern. So much so that paranormal investigation teams from all over the world have traveled to California in the hopes of seeing a ghost. Two of the most famous deaths on the cruise liner were crew member John Petter, an 18-year-old who was crushed under a steel door, and Senior Second Officer W.E. Stark, who accidentally drank acid he thought was gin. Man, if I had a nickel. Since his death, people have reported hearing eerie sounds, experiencing odd lights and cold spots, and even the apparition of a young man in overalls near the door where Petter perished. You can experience a lot of this yourself by booking a tour in the most spiritually active spots on the ship. Just don't drink the gin. Possibly the most famous poltergeist on this list, the Bell Witch has been haunting people's imaginations since 1804. John Bell and his family moved to a farm in Robertson County, Tennessee, and had a pretty uneventful 13 years there to start out. However, in the summer of 1817, all hell suddenly broke loose. The family began seeing strange creatures on their land. At the same time, odd noises started sounding off in the home. It was just a few bumps and knocks at first, the kind of thing a horror movie character would shrug off as the wind before being eaten by a werewolf. But the noises turned into full-on voices that spoke directly to the family and would start conversations about religion or even predict the future. Yeah, let's hear the wind do that. The ghost would disappear for a while, but would always find its way back to the family with a fresh torture to offer. John and his youngest daughter, Betsy, got it the worst from the Bell Witch. It would threaten John directly and once knocked Betsy unconscious. John eventually perished in 1820, and many attributed his death to the witch's never-ending torments. Today, the property is still a hotbed of paranormal activity, with some visitors claiming to see strange shapes and orbs appear in their photographs. Whoever the Bell Witch is, she isn't shy. Albuquerque, New Mexico is home to the Chemo Theater, which opened its doors in 1927 and is still in operation today. So you can bet it's seen its fair share of hauntings. And we're not just talking about the run of Seussical they did. One of their more tragic stories is that of Bobby Darnell, a 6-year-old boy who was killed when the boiler under the concession stand exploded. From that day on, theatergoers and workers have reported seeing a little boy running around and playing pranks. This is especially true for the performers on stage, who avoid getting tricked during shows by leaving out treats like donuts or candy to appease their pee-wee poltergeist. There are stories of shows going haywire if someone ever touches the snacks or forgets to put them out. If you've ever seen a hungry child, you know this part is true. And Bobby isn't alone either. Another frequently spotted spirit is a young woman wearing a bonnet who wanders the theater, appearing to mind her own business like she's looking for her seat or something. What are the odds she's in cahoots with Bobby for half the candy? Kate and Maggie Fox were young girls when their family moved into a haunted cottage in New York's Hydesville Memorial Park in 1848. Before they moved in, no family had been brave enough to stick it out in the house due to all the literal bumps in the night. In March of 1848, Kate and Maggie were in bed listening to the mysterious noises when they decided to have a conversation with the spirit. They learned that they were speaking to the late Charles B. Rosna, who claimed to have been the victim of foul play and was buried in the basement. Boy, imaginary friends back then were intense. Attempts to find Rosna's body were stalled due to flooding in the area, but the Fox sisters continued to contact the spirit, eventually growing up to become famous mediums and the first modern spiritualists. Interestingly enough, bones were eventually discovered in the wall in 1904, seemingly confirming the Fox children's story. The home still stands and is open to visitors who hear bumping and knocking to this day. Jean Lafitte was an infamous pirate who lived in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the early part of the 1800s. Lafitte smuggled everything from spices and jewels all the way up to human beings, so he was not the most scrupulous fellow. Lafitte was well known in the city, whetting the beaks of the wealthy elite and running a blacksmith shop, which is still open to this day. Legend has it that this pirate hid his booty somewhere in that shop, but so far, nobody has been able to find it. This might be because whenever anyone gets close, they'll spot a pair of red eyes staring up at them through the cracks in the walls and fireplace. When the evil red pirate eyes meet your gaze, it is time to exit the shop. Those eyes could be hidden gems, but who wants to stick around long enough to find out? In the early days of the Colorado Gold Rush, Buckskin Joe was a bustling mining town boasting a population of 5,000. Residents of Buckskin Joe found entertainment in the various dance halls, saloons, and bars the town had to offer. As the story goes, the dancing gigs brought a beautiful young woman to town, dressed head to toe in black. She got a job at Buck Bill's Dance Hall, where her beauty made her extremely popular with the patrons. She was given the nickname Silver Heels, thanks to the shiny silver heels she often wore. And to be fair, you are hoping for a nickname with those shoes. Tragedy struck when a smallpox epidemic tore through the town. Silver Heels hung up her dancing gowns and threw on some scrubs to attend to the sick townsfolk, eventually falling ill herself. She was nursed by a woman named Aunt Martha, the only person allowed in her home during her recovery. One night, Silver Heels got out of bed, dressed herself, bid Aunt Martha good night, and disappeared forever. A search was conducted with no luck. Silver Heels was gone without a trace. Or was she? Soon after her mysterious disappearance, a figure began appearing at the nearby Buckskin Joe Cemetery. The figure was clad in all black and would walk from tombstone to tombstone, laying flowers. Perhaps a subtle dig against the groundskeeper? Most people believe the spirit is Silver Heels, comforting all the people who succumbed to the outbreak. Of course, you could ask her yourself. The Buckskin Joe Cemetery is still operating and still cranking out ghost sightings to this day. If you grew up in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, then you've probably heard the tale of Charlie No-Face, also sometimes known as the Green Man. According to legend, Charlie was a utility worker who was disfigured in a horrible accident involving acid or an electric power line. You know how Con Ed workers regularly come into contact with acid. Some versions of the story have Charlie's skin turning green, but in every variation, his face melts off. That's the main takeaway here. Charlie allegedly wanders dark, foreboding places, like the old abandoned railway access tunnel in the South Park Township, which is often referred to as the Green Man's Tunnel. For years, local teens have driven into the tunnel hoping to see Charlie No-Face. Some have claimed to see his glowing ghost in the tunnel or along rural roads at night. Many even say they have felt an electrical charge from his presence and had problems getting their cars to start back up after calling out to him. So bring a spare battery if you're going to give this a shot. While the details of his story are quite a bit different, Charlie No-Face was a real guy named Raymond Robinson. Back in 1919, Raymond was playing near an electrical power line and got electrocuted. His nose was burned off and one of his arms and both of his eyes were scorched. But he survived. Raymond, who was by all accounts a friendly man, spent the rest of his life keeping to himself, only venturing out for walks at night when people were less likely to gawk at him. One of the most common urban legends tells of a family who unknowingly lives with a deranged lunatic hiding out in their attic. Over time, the family notices strange things like items that go missing or mysterious things in the trash and begin to joke about having a ghost, all before finally being filleted in their sleep by the crazy person living in their walls. The story is so frightening because it could easily happen, and chillingly, it actually has. It all began on a German farm in March of 1922. Andreas Gruber, the owner, started noticing small things missing or out of place. His family reported the sound of footsteps, and Andreas himself found mysterious footprints, but no person. By the end of March, the source of those footsteps descended from the attic and brutally dispatched Andreas, his wife, their adult daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, and their housekeeper, all with a mattock, which is similar to a pickaxe. Their bodies weren't discovered until 4 or 5 days later, during which time the murderer, whose identity remains a mystery to this day, continued to care for the family's farm animals, which you have to admit is fairly considerate. In 1981, video gamers in Oregon were living in mortal terror of a new arcade game called Poltergeist that had been popping up in the suburbs of Portland. The game, which routinely had long lines forming around it shortly after its arrival, was alleged to operate like a drug. Gamers became addicted to the point of having hallucinations, amnesia, night terrors, and insomnia. And that was not all. Men in black, who were definitely not doing a fun dance to a Will Smith song, would routinely come by to collect data that Polybius was gathering from its addled-addicted users. And then one day, the game just disappeared. If you can't wait to try this game, you're out of luck. Despite some fake pictures of its cabinet and home screen that had been floating around online for years, Polybius never really existed. The real story is much less fantastic. There was a game called Tempest released around that time that caused some players to experience nausea and motion sickness. And the FBI did conduct raids on a few arcades for gambling, which could be the source of the Men in Black rumors. The urban legend of the Night Doctors, also sometimes known as Night Riders or Clan Doctors, comes from African American folklore, predominantly in Georgia and Alabama. The story tells of doctors who would ride around at night abducting black workers to perform experiments on them. Night doctors would snatch people off the streets and take them to medical facilities to perform experiments on them, including organ harvesting. While the night doctors themselves weren't real, there are some stories of slave masters on horseback riding around at night in white sheets, pretending to be ghosts, a tradition later continued by the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War. Also, stories of white doctors victimizing black communities have roots in true events. During the early 19th century, grave robbing was a primary method of procuring cadavers for medical students, and many African Americans were powerless to protect their dead. Medical students also really performed surgeries on living people. In fact, Southern teaching hospitals would only perform live surgical techniques for medical students on African American patients. Over time, the stories of ghoulish slave masters riding around at night merged with the stories of gruesomely unscrupulous doctors and became the Night Doctors legend. The Hookman story generally involves a couple making out in a car on Lover's Lane when they hear a scratching at the door. Depending on which version you've heard, they may also hear a radio report about an escaped lunatic with a hook for a hand, which is kind of a spoiler, if we're being honest. The girl gets spooked and asks the reluctant boy to drive her home. When they arrive at her house, the couple exit the car to find a bloody hook dangling from the passenger door handle. Cue ominous music. There are a lot of versions of the Hookman story. Sometimes the couple makes it home safely, sometimes the boy ends up getting whacked and dangling from a tree. Sometimes it becomes the 1997 slasher film, I Know What You Did Last Summer, which is partly inspired by this urban legend. These tales spread like wildfire around 1950. The real-life Moonlight Murders had recently plagued Texarkana in 1946. Wearing a sack with eye holes cut out over his head, an unknown man began picking off couples parked in their cars at night. Terrified residents had to be home before curfew each night as authorities on both the Arkansas and Texas side struggled to identify the elusive Phantom Killer. They never did, and the Phantom disappeared into the night. While that guy didn't have a hook for a hand, many experts think the Texarkana slayings inspired the Hookman legend. Others believe it's no more than a cautionary tale to discourage teens from having sex. According to locals of Quitman, Arkansas, the Dog Boy was a cruel little kid who liked torturing small animals and eventually moved on to bigger animals, like his own parents. Today, he haunts the house where he terrorized his parents, appearing as a dog-human hybrid ghost that still delights in inflicting pain on anyone or anything. Allegedly, those who pass his house can see him peering out of the front window, and some have even been chased down the street by a spectral beast on all fours. Witnesses describe Dog Boy as being a large, shaggy, dog-like creature with the eyes of a cat, which is kind of confusing, like pick a theme, guy. While there never was a Dog Boy, there was a particularly nasty character named Gerald Bettis. As a kid, Bettis had a habit of collecting neighborhood animals to bring home and torment. His compulsion became so bad he eventually had an additional room added to the house just to keep his animals. Bettis grew into a mammoth of a man, standing at 6'4" and weighing 300 pounds. He was known to be abusive to his parent and was suspected of fatally shoving his father down a flight of stairs. He also neglected his elderly mother, keeping her cooped up and rarely feeding her. Adult Protective Services eventually had to step in and take his mother out of the house. Bettis was eventually sent to prison for growing and selling weed out of his house, and luckily for the rest of us, he passed away behind bars. Everybody knows about Bloody Mary. All you have to do in order to conjure this malicious spirit is to light some candles, dim the lights, and mutter Mary's name while staring into a mirror. Once she appears, there's a whole host of potential things she might do that range from the benign to the downright terrifying, depending on which version of the story you've heard. Give it a try when you're bored sometime. Bloody Mary may not be real, but according to some psychologists, it is possible to see someone else staring back at you if you gaze into a mirror long enough. Italian psychologist Giovanni Caputo calls the phenomenon the strange face illusion. According to him, if you stare at your own face in a mirror long enough, your visual field will start to distort. Lines and edges will begin to lose their distinctions, and your face will begin to look different. It's all connected to a phenomenon called pareidolia, and is also the reason people see things like seeing faces in inanimate objects. So the next time you see Abe Lincoln's profile burned into a Pop-Tart, you know the proper medical term to tell the newspapers. As far as these things go, the Alice killings is a fairly new urban legend that has started circulating in Japan. The story goes that a string of homicides happened in Japan between 1999 and 2005. At each crime scene, the name Alice was always written somewhere nearby in the victim's blood. Some versions also claim that police found a playing card carefully placed at each scene. The legend claims that police made an arrest in 2005 when a suspect was found wearing a jacket that belonged to one of the victims. The arrested man claimed the jacket was given to him by a demon with no face. But of course, there was no arrested man because there were no Alice killings. The urban legend appears to be inspired by a real-life guy known as the Playing Card Killer, who terrorized Spain's capital city of Madrid around 2003, claiming 6 victims and injuring 3 more. Apart from always leaving a playing card at the scene of each crime, there was no clear connection and no apparent motive, so authorities had little to go on. Alfredo Galán Sotillo eventually confessed to the crimes, but he changed his story multiple times and ultimately claimed he had been forced to confess by a mysterious third party. But conspiracy or not, Sotillo was sentenced to 140 years in prison. The Blackwater urban legend begins with a family purchasing a new home. Everything is perfect until they turn on a sink and murky, black, sour-smelling water comes out. They check the water tank and discover a rotting corpse has been floating in there for who knows how long and contaminating the supply. Exactly how this story got started is unknown, but we do know that it's happened for real at least once. In 2013, the body of Eliza Lamb was discovered in the water tank of the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles, California. The circumstances surrounding her untimely end remain a mystery, but her body had been in the tank for a week until guests began to complain of sour-tasting water coming out of taps and shower heads. When maintenance went up to check on the water tower, they discovered Lamb's body. We're assuming most of these guests checked out early. What is now Greenwood Cemetery in Decatur, Illinois, was first used as sacred burial grounds by Native Americans hundreds of years before any Europeans lived there. The first European settlers erected a log cabin in the area in 1820. As the next few years passed, more frontiersmen continued to arrive from the east, adding to the region's new hardscrabble population. Life was hard and unpredictable. Anything from weather to illnesses could quickly wipe out an entire family. Due to necessity, this meant there wasn't much to the burial customs for these frontier people. After a few brief prayers and Bible passages, the deceased would be placed in a simple hole in the ground, often wrapped only in a winding sheet and left to the earth. As the years went on and the mortality rates increased, many of the settlers began searching for a communal place to bury their dead. Look, when money is tight, you need to do things as efficiently as possible, and that includes burying people. This need led them to burying their deceased in places that the Native Americans had also used, on the site which would eventually become Greenwood Cemetery. And while the settlers and Native Americans shared the area for a brief time, the settlers ultimately drove the tribe away from the area with an act of cold-blooded violence. Dubbed by historian Roy V. Ternius as the Moonshiners and the Indians, The incident is thought to have occurred in the late 1820s, possibly 1828, according to records. Regardless of the exact year, in the spring of the year in question, a small group of moonshiners chased some Native American people who were passing by their still. The reason for the pursuit and subsequent attack is unknown, but we do know that the Native Americans were chased through the woods and forced up a hill in the direction of the burial grounds. Once they were cornered, the moonshiners gunned them down and concealed their bodies in a shallow ravine on the side of the hill, which they covered with stones. The resulting crude grave can still be seen on the southwestern part of the cemetery. Wonder why everyone thinks that place is haunted. Settlers continued to use the area as a corpse garden, and by 1857 it was incorporated as Greenwood Cemetery. After it fell into extreme disrepair in the 1920s following the Great Depression, eerie ghost stories began to circulate about its restless residents. But the spooky tales weren't enough to dissuade some people. By the 1950s, Greenwood had become something of a secret hideout for criminals. There were reports of gangs using the cemetery as a meetup spot at night to avoid the police. There were even rumors of cults using the grounds for various black magic rituals, which was probably nonsense, but hey, I'm not going out there to prove them wrong. But any of these stories of the living playing with the occult forces is nothing compared to the vast collection of undead apparitions said to have made Greenwood their eternal home. One of these legends of otherworldly encounters is the Weeping Woman of the Barackman Steppes, one of Greenwood's most frequently spotted residents. Greenwood Cemetery is a rolling mix of hills and valleys, and on one of these hills are 5 stone steps which lead up to the 4 gravestones of the Barackman family. Throughout the years, there have been numerous reports of a woman standing at the top of the steps with her head bowed, crying like she just got a look at her monthly cable bill. This broken-hearted specter only appears in the evening and is said to vanish with the sunset. But while this weeping woman has made a good amount of appearances, her legend pales in comparison to Greenwood's most famous and tragic spirit. In 1930, a young couple was engaged to be married, but the young groom-to-be was a bit too wild for the family of his future bride. It seems that during these waning years of prohibition, this young man made his money selling illegal whiskey, which, while not being a terribly uncommon profession at the time, could still be very dangerous, and probably wasn't great son-in-law material. You don't want your daughter to marry a man who might suddenly get shot, arrested, or blown up while bringing home the bacon. One summer night, the couple planned to meet up and finally run away together to elope. The plan was for the two to leave just after midnight, after the young man delivered a final shipment of whiskey to supply them with the money they needed for their secret wedding trip. He never showed up, but he hadn't gotten cold feet. He'd been gunned down by a rival bootlegger while delivering his whiskey, and the culprit had dumped his body into the Sangamon River. Well, I guess so technically he did get cold feet. After waiting for him all night, the young would-be bride learned of her fiancé's fate when his body was discovered by local fishermen. He was buried at Greenwood Cemetery, which you probably saw coming. But what you may not have seen coming is that the young woman, unable to face life without her beloved, plunged into the river and drowned. Hey, look, it's a ghost story. It's gonna be sad. Nobody turns into a poltergeist after living an awesome life and passing away peacefully in a gigantic bed. The woman's parents decided to bury her in her wedding gown. Soon after, stories began circulating about a young woman in a white wedding dress walking through the cemetery, weeping and looking through the headstones, presumably searching for her lost love. It's been 100 years, you'd think she'd have found it by now. Maybe they're moving the headstones to prank the ghosts. That's a reality show. Ghost Prankers. While the Greenwood Bride is one of the most well-known of the cemetery ghost stories, she is far from the strangest. One of the weirdest legends of Greenwood revolves around its devil's chair. The chair in question is actually what's known as a mourning chair, a bit of furniture placed by graves so that family and friends will have a place to sit while they visit their loved ones. But according to some superstitions, when someone sits on one of these chairs, they will be cursed with bad luck, or even die within a year. But there are others who say that sitting in a mourning chair is actually good luck, or might even promise riches for those who take a rest in them. Superstitions are nothing if not inconsistent. What if you just made your headstone a chair? But the ones revolving around the Devil's Chair in Greenwood Cemetery are a little different than the average mourning chair folklore. These stories say that if you sit on the chair in Greenwood at a certain time of night, you can make a pact with the devil himself. This pact will enable you to get anything you want for 7 years. Then, as is customary for any Faustian transaction, the devil will promptly return to collect your soul as payment at the end of the 7 years. If a deal with the devil only lasts for 7 years, how did 2.5 Men stay on for 12? Charlie Sheen, that guy can negotiate. Interestingly, while many cemeteries have removed their mourning chairs because of vandalism, Greenwood's chairs remain. But what doesn't remain is the Greenwood Public Mausoleum, which was built in 1908 and demolished in 1967. According to reports, the construction was shoddy, causing the mausoleum to leak. By the 1940s, the mausoleum had slipped into complete disrepair. Soon afterwards, unexplained reports of strange voices coming from the building began to spread. People swore they could hear crying and even screaming. By 1957, the mausoleum was declared to be unsafe and was closed. Families were notified and asked to relocate their loved ones. But even so, over 100 bodies were never claimed. Some were never even identified. The cemetery buried these remains in several common graves after the mausoleum was demolished, which was a good move, definitely not a recipe for creating more ghosts. The site of the former mausoleum is still vacant today, nearly 5 decades later. The common graves of the mausoleum's unidentified former residents are across the road, where voices and screams continue to be reported, along with eerie phantom lights seen moving at night. But even these unnatural lights can't hold a candle to the most haunted area of Greenwood Cemetery. During the Civil War, troop trains on their way to Confederate prison camps near Chicago would stop in Decatur. One such train stopped to unload most of its cargo, the deceased bodies of Southern prisoners who had succumbed to yellow fever on the way north. The expired Confederate soldiers were loaded into a massive unmarked grave, although rumors persist to this day that some of them weren't all the way dead yet. After the war, a memorial to honor the Union troops of Illinois was built on top of the site. Okay, cemeteries should make you take a class about not pissing off the dead. It's like they're doing it on purpose. Several years later, the nearby Sangamon River flooded, washing away many of the Confederate remains. After the flood, stories began to circulate of ghost soldiers wandering the cemetery and chilling the blood with their anguished cries. People also claim to see phantom lights flickering rapidly through the graves. Local legends insist that these are the spirits of the Confederate soldiers searching for their earthly remains. One popular account said to have occurred within the last 10 years begins with a young boy walking along the road in the back corner of the cemetery. The boy claims to have seen a man standing on top of the hill who waved over to him. The boy approached him only to see that he was wearing tattered gray clothes covered with dark spots that appeared to be blood. The man seemed to be confused and asked the boy for help, claiming that he didn't know where he was and that he just wanted to get home. But before the boy could answer, the man vanished right before his eyes. Did the story really happen? And if it did, was the man the boy saw a ghost? Or just some guy who got hammered on the devil's chair the night before and couldn't find his phone to call an Uber? Even if it's unnerving or downright frightening, the thought of ghosts returning to visit the living provides a strange comfort because it serves as proof of the afterlife. But why do ghosts only seem to show up in graveyards or other creepy spots? Does that mean there is an afterlife, but you're stuck within the confines of a creaky mansion or behind the gates of a cemetery for eternity? That's enough spooky talk for now. Time to curl up with a sack full of candy and a peanut special. Wonder if the devil's chair reclines.
Anneliese Michael was born on September 21, 1952, to a fairly normal Bavarian family in West Germany. The Michaels were heavily into Catholicism, but that wasn't all that surprising considering 70% of the almost 11 million residents were Catholic at the time. Still, Anneliese's family was more religious than most. Her parents forced her and her 3 sisters to go to Catholic Mass twice a week. Her mother in particular pushed her to pray and devote as much extra time as possible towards religious devotion. According to the doctors Anneliese met with later, she developed neurosis related to religious iconography as a result of punishments inflicted upon her as a young girl. Remember this diagnosis, as it'll come into play later. Still, as religiously oppressive as the Michael house was, Anneliese's friends said she was initially a great student, showed strength in language study, and was happy and playful. The constant helicopter parenting and strict religious upbringing she had to endure would come back to haunt the family, almost literally several years later. Whether it was possession or mental illness, Annalisa's condition began rather gradually over a period of years. While at school one day in 1968, a then 16-year-old Annalisa unexpectedly blacked out for a few minutes. During this first documented blackout, her classmates said she fell into a trance-like state. Annalisa says she didn't remember the event and claimed she was fine after the ordeal, but the same night she woke up feeling like there was a presence pressing heavily down on her body, and then went to bed. Annalisa's parents kept her home the following day, and it seemed like it was a one-off occurrence. Annalisa said she felt fine, and she was until August of 1968. Less than a year later, Annalisa experienced a similar episode and was taken to a local hospital to determine what had happened. Her doctor, Dr. Vogt, referred her to a neurologist, Dr. Siegfried Luthi. After an examination and a series of tests, Dr. Luthi couldn't find anything wrong with her brain function. Physically, Annalisa seemed completely healthy, a clean bill of health. It wasn't until sometime in February of 1970 that Annalisa experienced a third event. After catching tuberculosis and spending months in a hospital, Annalisa had her third blackout. When the other patients in the hospital found out she had wet her bed during her blackout, they openly mocked her and excluded her from any group activity. This third blackout was different, though. Annalisa said she saw colors, heard sounds, and experienced feelings of euphoria while praying with her rosary beads. After more tests, a second neurologist, Dr. von Haller, diagnosed her with epilepsy and prescribed her medication. That's when Annalisa's condition got worse. Annalisa eventually returned to school later in 1970, but now she was depressed and withdrawn around her friends, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that the frequency of her seizures increased. Her doctor's visits offered no insight into where the root of her seizures were coming from, which only compounded her family's frustration with the situation. Annalisa pressed on, though. She threw herself into researching Catholicism while finishing up high school, and in 1973, she enrolled at the University of Würzburg to become a teacher. She continued to take medication during this time, but her condition was rapidly worsening. By mid-73, Annalisa experienced hallucinations while praying and believed she was damned. She was obsessed with the idea that the devil was inside her and began to see a priest along with her doctors. By late 73, Annalisa's strange behavior and erratic symptoms kicked into overdrive. Her parents took her out of college and kept her confined, mostly to her bedroom. It was during this time when she started taking Tegretol, an anti-seizure drug and mood stabilizer. It should also be noted that at this time, Annalisa said she heard a knocking in her bedroom. Her sisters confirmed that they heard the knocking as well. She also said she heard a voice that would regularly damn her to hell. Despite taking her daily cocktail of neuroleptic medications, Annalisa's symptoms worsened. She started growling like an animal, she saw demons, and she exhibited Hulk-like strength to the point that she'd throw her sister around the house like a rag doll. She'd also lick her urine off the floor, chew coal, rip her clothes off, and eat insects she found around the house. Religious items like crucifixes and holy water also drove her mad. Her mother said she once caught Annalisa staring at a framed portrait of the Virgin Mary. She said her daughter's eyeballs were 100% jet black. This all sounds like the classic symptoms of what the church would consider demonic possession. Annalisa's family eventually asked several local priests for an exorcism, but the men declined and encouraged the Michels to continue with the traditional medical treatment she was already receiving. Besides, it wasn't that easy. A Catholic exorcism required the bishop's permission. Sometime in September of 1973, the Michels met Father Ernst Alt, a local priest who, upon meeting Annalisa, almost immediately said she didn't look like an epileptic and claimed she wasn't suffering from seizures. Father Alt was convinced she was possessed by demons and got the local bishop to give permission for the exorcism. Bishop Joseph Stangl eventually granted Father Arnold Renz permission to exorcise Annalisa in compliance with the Ritual Romanum of 1614, but ordered the exorcism to be done in complete secrecy. While Renz performed Annalisa's first exorcism on September 24, 1975, she began to talk about dying to atone for the wayward youth of the day and the apostate priests of the modern church. Eventually, she stopped eating because she said she was not permitted to anymore. By this point, Annalisa's parents gave up consulting doctors and cut her off her medication. Instead, they relied solely on the exorcisms, 67 exorcisms in all, over an 11-month span in 1975 and 1976, to be exact. It wasn't unusual for Annalisa to endure 2 sessions a week, some sessions lasting up to 4 hours. And in audio recordings from the sessions, you can clearly hear Annalisa's distorted guttural voice. She growls like a wild beast, and you can hear the utterances she made in response to the religious ritual. And these all sound super creepy. The gruesome audio recordings during her exorcisms also reveal that Fathers Renz and Alt talked to 6 spirits allegedly possessing Annalisa. These spirits, or personalities if that's what they were, made up a murderer's row of evil incarnate. Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, Nero, Cain, Hitler, and Valentin Fleischmann, a disgraced Frankish priest from the 16th century. Given Annalisa's history with religion and her obsession with Christian teachings, there were later theories that Annalisa chose these figures intentionally. It's almost impossible not to agree. Despite being pretty much skin and bones at this point, Annalisa still had to be held down while her exorcisms took place. This abuse, along with a lack of medical treatment and food or water, took a toll on her body, and she died at home on July 1st, 1976. On her death certificate, it read that Annalisa ultimately died of malnutrition and dehydration, though her autopsy revealed she also had fractured teeth, 2 black eyes, and bruises on her hands, arms, and wrists. She also had broken knees and numerous wounds on her body. Fathers Alt and Renz, as well as Annalisa's parents, faced trial for a negligent homicide in 1978. The priest boldly maintained the exorcism was successful and liberated Annalisa from the demons possessing her. Alt even doubled down and insisted that some of Annalisa's wounds that were documented in her autopsy were the stigmata. The evidence didn't line up, though, and Annalisa's alleged demonic possession wasn't enough to sway the German court's 3-judge panel. All parties were found guilty, but their sentences varied. Alt and Renz were charged with manslaughter and given 6 months in prison with suspended sentences. Annalisa's parents received no punishment, as the German legal system deemed they had experienced enough suffering. So there's really only one main question to ask, and it's an important one. Was Annalisa Michael possessed by Satan or some other dark, sinister force? Or was she suffering from an undiagnosed mental illness?
In 1971, Roger and Carolyn Perrin, along with their 5 daughters, April, Cindy, Christine, Nancy, and Andrea, moved into their new house, located in Harrisville, Rhode Island. If you've seen The Conjuring, you already have an idea of where this is going. But the most curious thing that happened to them didn't have anything to do with ghosts. Rather, it was a piece of advice given to them by their neighbors. For the sake of your family, leave the lights on at night. It wasn't long after receiving that fateful piece of advice that the Perrins encountered their first paranormal entity. As with all hauntings and long-term paranormal experiences, the terrifying events of the real-life conjuring began as strange occurrences that barely registered as paranormal activity. Things moved. There were weird noises. It was nothing out of the ordinary for an old house. According to Cynthia Perrin, there were a lot of small things happening that no one talked about until it was too late. Unfortunately, the serenity of a banal haunting wouldn't last for long. After moving into their dream home, the Perrins almost immediately realized that they were living with what they believed to have been an entire set of ghost roommates. At the onset of the haunting, the Perrin children felt that most of the entities that walked their halls were benevolent, if not benign. The children even claimed that the initial entities occasionally acted as babysitters. Some nights, the ghosts would even tuck them in and kiss their foreheads. Both Cynthia and Andrea Perrin remember the ghost who tucked them in. They even remember the way she smelled. According to Cynthia, when they first moved into the house, for the first 2 months, there was a ghost woman that came and kissed her every night on the forehead. At first, she thought it was her mother, but something was off. As her sister Andrea put it, Mom smelled like ivory soap, and this spirit smelled like flowers and fruit. After learning to live with their friendly ghosts, the Perrin family made a go of it on their new farm. However, it didn't take long for more malevolent forces to begin creeping into their little slice of a somewhat spooky heaven. The Perrin girls claim that they were attacked in the barn by unseen entities, and that on one evening, a series of voices began to speak to them about the bodies in their walls. Andrea claims that her sister Cindy climbed into bed with her one night to tell her about the harrowing news a disembodied voice had delivered. According to Cindy, the ghost told her there are 7 dead soldiers buried in the wall. While the girls were dealing with something reaching out to them from beyond the grave, a different series of events began that foreshadowed the terror to come. They claim that at 5:15 in the morning, the smell of rotting flesh would waft through the house, tossing everyone out of bed one by one. Andrea claims that around this time, that the girls were visited by a male ghost that tortured them so badly that she refuses to give any concrete details. Let's just say there was a very bad male spirit in the home, with 5 little girls. Given the implication, you'd think the family would pack up and leave at that very moment, even if they didn't have anywhere else to go. But astonishingly, they decided to stick it out. While the entire Perrin family had paranormal encounters throughout their time living in the house, Carolyn Perrin, the matriarch of the family, seems to have been the most sensitive to the spirits inhabiting the home. In an interview with the Providence Journal, she claimed that she knew something was wrong when a woman in gray appeared next to her bed moaning, get out, I'll drive you out with death and gloom." That's a not too subtle hint. Maybe they should take it. I would. The woman in the gray dress could have been the ghost of a woman named Bathsheba Thayer, who is the witch believed to have done most of the haunting in this case. That being said, she could have also been a poltergeist created as a portent of things to come, or one of the many ghosts who dwelled within the home. Ghostbusters notwithstanding, this isn't exactly a science. Andrea Perrin, the eldest daughter, later said, whoever the spirit was, she perceived herself to be mistress of the house, and she resented the competition my mother posed for that position. Again, you'd think the whole death and gloom thing would send the family running, but like a good horror film, the answer would be no. The Perrins allege that Bathsheba Thayer's attacks began as harmless poltergeist activity. They were pinched, poked, and prodded by a seemingly invisible force. But then, things escalated. The Perrins believe Thayer wanted them to leave. Pretty obvious. Remember the get out thing? They also think Thayer tried to get what she wanted by torturing Carolyn. When physically assaulting Carolyn didn't work, the parents claimed that Thayer inhabited Carolyn's body to better horrify them. That sounds like an effective strategy. Possessing Carolyn gave Thayer the power to cause the mother and her family intense bodily harm, and it left Carolyn feeling weak and emotionally drained. One of the strangest parts of this story isn't the gray witch that haunted the family, or the broom ghost that was known to sweep up the kitchen whenever no one was around. It's how the story came to the attention of Ed and Lorraine Warren, the paranormal investigators who helped turn the Amityville haunting into a household name. Most accounts of the subject claim that the family reached out to the Warrens. But according to Andrea Perrin, a family friend went to see the Warrens while they were giving a talk in Putnam, Connecticut. Cynthia Perrin backs up this claim, saying in an interview that a family friend named Barbara went to the Warrens' lecture and then told the family about the couple. After Carolyn allegedly became possessed with the spirit of Thayer, the Perrins got in touch with Ed and Lorraine Warren. The couple came to investigate, and Lorraine Warren claimed that she sensed a dark presence in the house from moment one. According to the Perrins, the Warrens cleansed the home and conducted a seance with Carolyn in the family's basement. Unfortunately, the seance did not go as planned and made things much worse. The Warrens visited the Perrin family intermittently over the course of the next decade, but they were never able to fix anything. Lorraine never publicly discussed what happened during the seance, but she does claim what happened in the basement disturbed her to the core. Andrea Perrin corroborates Lorraine's story. She claims that she snuck into the basement to see the seance firsthand and was never able to look at her mother the same way again. According to Andrea, her mother began to speak a language not of this world in a voice not of her own. Her chair levitated, and she was thrown across the room. So, 8-year-old spoiler alert, if you saw the Conjuring movie, then you probably remember a series of escalating games of hide and clap, where one person is blindfolded while the rest of the girls playing run off to hide. In these scenes, the mother is consistently taunted by a pair of ghostly clapping hands belonging to Bathsheba Thayer. The hide and clap scenes are super spooky, but it turns out that the real story is much more harrowing. Cynthia Perrin claims that one day while the girls were playing hide-and-seek on the farm, she hid in a pine box without any kind of lock, latch, or ventilation. After no one came to find her, Cynthia decided to find a new hiding place. She later told an interviewer that when she tried to get out, the box wouldn't open. She started to panic and began pushing at the lid. She kicked and screamed, but no one heard her. Luckily, 20 minutes later, her sister Nancy came along and simply opened the box for her. Paranormal or crappy old box? We'll let you decide. According to the Perrin family, they're still being haunted by Bathsheba Thayer. During the filming of The Conjuring, the entire family was invited to the set. Initially, they were all going to go, but at the last minute, Carolyn got cold feet and changed her mind. She claimed that she didn't want to make the trip, but it's also not hard to imagine there was some trepidation on her part to dig up the past. Andrea Perrin claims that while the family was being interviewed, a rogue wind swept them over, knocking down cameras, lights, and anything that surrounded them. Meteorology notwithstanding, they all agreed it was Bathsheba's curse. When they returned to their hotels that evening, the kids learned their mother had fallen and broken her hip at the exact time that the eerie wind swept over them. When the family made it to their mother's hospital room, they claimed that she sat up and said, "Bathsheba's curse. She does not want to be exposed." According to Andrea Perrin, everyone who has lived in the house that we know of has experienced the haunting. Some have left screaming and running for their lives. She claims the man they sold it to started a restoration project, but left screaming without his car, without his tools, and without his clothing. However, according to the current owner, Norma Sutcliffe, the house isn't as haunted as you might have heard. Sutcliffe only claims to have seen and heard people talking in other rooms, footsteps when no one is home, and a strange blue light shooting around a room. Yeah, Norma, that's still not normal. Get out. After The Conjuring was released, Sutcliffe became so unhappy with all the attention surrounding her home, she attempted to disprove the Perrin family story. The demonic antagonist of The Conjuring is a witch named Bathsheba Thayer, born Bathsheba Sherman. The Perrin family claims the spirit of this woman haunted them for nearly a decade, possessed their mother, and even followed them onto the set of a film. But was Thayer really a witch? Or is she just the victim of bad press? The film posits that Thayer sacrificed her baby to Satan before hanging herself in order to become a malevolent spirit within the Rhode Island farmhouse. However, it turns out that Bathsheba was just a normal woman who was married and had 4 children. 3 of them did die at a young age, but this was the 19th century, so it wasn't that unusual. In 1885, Bathsheba passed away from a stroke and was buried next to her first husband and 3 children. Finally, one of the biggest questions most people have about the haunting of the Perrin family is, why would you just not leave? I have that question. It's a reasonable question. According to them, the answer is money. It simply wasn't financially possible for the family to leave. The haunting was happening during the end of the Nixon administration, all the way through the Carter administration. The economy was terrible, and no matter how good your friends are, no one has a room to house 5 teenage girls and their mother and father. Aside from that, Andrea Perrin notes that the property value on their 200-acre farm was devaluing by the day, and the family would have been destitute if they had just walked away. In 1980, the Perrin family was finally able to sell the house, and as soon as the paperwork was signed, they made a beeline for Georgia and never looked back. As to whether this is a convincing reason to stay in a house with ghosts that take control of your body and abuse your daughters, well, like with every other aspect of this story, you'll just have to decide what you believe for yourself.
After director Steven Spielberg made the sci-fi blockbuster Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Columbia Pictures wanted a sequel, which didn't really interest the young filmmaker. Instead, he proposed an alien invasion horror movie called Night Skies. This project never came to fruition, but ideas developed for Night Skies ended up influencing 2 other massively popular films from the 1980s, Spielberg's own E.T. and the Tobe Hooper ghost freakout Poltergeist. Now, E.T.'s legacy is mostly cute imagery and Reese's Pieces, but Poltergeist's legacy is marred by tragedy, death, and allegedly a curse. Rumors about a curse associated with the Poltergeist franchise are largely attributable to a number of tragedies that have impacted the film's cast members over the years. But all of these individual tragedies might have been written off as coincidence if they'd all befallen actors from a different movie franchise, say, one that wasn't about ghosts and curses. The Poltergeist films are thematically centered on curses, which makes the macabre connection all too easy to make. The first film in the series follows the Freeling family as they move to a planned community in Cuesta Verde, California, after the father, Steve, gets a lucrative new gig selling real estate. The family soon begin experiencing paranormal phenomena in their new home, while 5-year-old daughter Carol Ann makes personal contact with the spirit world. Ultimately, with the aid of various mediums, parapsychologists, and supernatural experts, the Freelings discover their new residence, along with much of the surrounding neighborhood, was constructed by greedy developers atop a former cemetery. Rather than exhuming the bodies and moving them to a new location, the homes were simply plopped right on top of the corpses in their graves. So, the house was not simply haunted, but plagued by a ghostly curse, which is really going to impact the resale value, no matter how good the schools are. The film's sequel picked up and ran with the curse theme. Poltergeist 2, The Other Side, finds the Freelings responding to their continued hauntings by seeking help from a Native American shaman, who shows them how to repel the curse via magical artifacts and charmed weapons. At one point during the production, actor Will Sampson, who portrayed the shaman character Taylor, claimed that he felt a malevolent presence on the set and performed his own small exorcism ceremony. Craig T. Nelson, who played Steve Freeling, claimed that following Sampson's exorcism, the unsettling presence on the set seemed to disappear. In the original 1982 film's production, 10-year-old actor Oliver Robbins, who portrayed the Freeling middle child Robbie, was actually choked on set by a malfunctioning mechanical clown. What's worse, because the scene in question featured the animatronic clown attacking Robbie, the cast and crew on set assumed they were simply seeing Robbins' incredible acting skills on display. No one realized he was in any actual danger until the boy started turning blue. Fortunately, they were able to react in time, and Robbins survived the incident unscathed, physically. In a 2022 Vanity Fair piece looking back on the original movie, Jo Beth Williams, who played Diane Freeling, recalled shooting a scene set in a muddy pit in the haunted home's backyard where the bodies beneath the foundation begin surfacing all around her and springing to life. While originally shooting the scene, Williams assumed that her skeletal co-stars were fabricated by the film's prop department. It was only many years later, while speaking to a former Poltergeist VFX team member, that she realized she'd been in a pool surrounded by real human skeletons. Believe it or not, using authentic human remains to aid in film production was not an unheard of practice. It's generally cheaper than building a prop skeleton, but nonetheless, the parallels between the movie's idea of badly treated corpses triggering a haunting and what subsequently happened with the Poltergeist cast can't be entirely ignored. Poltergeist 2 was also produced with the aid of real skeletons, because Hollywood loves a sequel. The concept of cursed movie franchise sounds like it could just be a bit of fun, or even a clever way to keep the franchise alive, no pun intended. But the sad truth is, the notion of a poltergeist curse has lingered on in the popular imagination because of a string of real-world tragedies. The most infamous case associated with the franchise concerns young Heather O'Rourke, who played Carol Ann. The young actress was just 5 years old when Spielberg spotted her in the MGM commissary, where she was hanging out with her mom while older sister Tammy shot the musical flop Pennies from Heaven. While Spielberg and his fellow producers had been considering Drew Barrymore for the Carol Ann role, Spielberg immediately felt that O'Rourke was ideal for the part. Barrymore wound up being cast in the movie's unofficial sister project, E.T., and her eerie delivery of the classic line, "They're here," consistently ranks on lists of memorable movie dialogue. She went on to appear in both of the Poltergeist theatrical sequels, along with a number of other notable TV projects for the remainder of her life. In early 1987, O'Rourke fell ill while in the middle of filming Poltergeist 3, and started experiencing digestive and intestinal problems. An infection of giardiasis, likely contracted from well water near her home in California's Big Bear Lake, resulted in a diagnosis of Crohn's disease. 1 year later, O'Rourke collapsed in her home and suffered a cardiac arrest. It was only then discovered that she suffered from a rare and severe birth defect, stenosis of the intestine, and sadly she did not recover, passing away at age 12. Dominique Dunn was in her early 20s when she won the role of the Freeling family's teenage daughter, Dana. Dunn made her acting debut in the TV movie Diary of a Teenage Hitchhiker and had scored a few other supporting roles in the interim, but Poltergeist was going to be her big break. After the film proved a smash hit at the box office, Dunn agreed to appear in the film's sequel and signed on for a role in the future blockbuster TV miniseries V. But this promising career came to a shocking end in October of 1982 when Dunn was strangled to death by her ex-boyfriend, John Thomas Sweeney, outside of her home in West Hollywood, California, just 4 months after Poltergeist was released. The case generated significant media attention, with Sweeney claiming he had acted in the heat of passion, but prosecutors pointing consistently to a history of violence and domestic abuse. Ultimately, Sweeney was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and misdemeanor assault, rather than second-degree murder, and was released from prison on parole after serving just 3 years and 7 months for the crime. The case provoked outrage. Dominique's mother, Ellen Dunn, founded the victims' rights advocacy group, Justice for Homicide Victims. Her father, Dominic Dunn, who had worked through the early 1980s as a film producer, published a book based on the journals he kept throughout the Sweeney trial and its aftermath. This led to an entirely new career for him, writing about the intersection of wealth and crime from the perspective of victims and their families. He went on to work for decades as an author and regular Vanity Fair contributor, and his work was massively influential on the current true crime craze. Any member of any of the film's ensemble casts can theoretically be impacted by the Poltergeist curse, not just the leads. For example, actor Lou Perryman co-stars as Pugsley in the original film, a construction worker who helps build the Freeling family pool. Perryman previously appeared in The Blues Brothers and was actually a crew member on the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, also directed by Hooper, which probably explains how Perryman found himself in Poltergeist. In April of 2009, Perryman was randomly killed in his Austin, Texas home by a total stranger, 28-year-old ex-con Seth Christopher Tatum, who had a history of both mental illness and drug problems, had attacked his mother's ex-boyfriend with a pair of garden shears and a fireplace poker earlier that day. He broke into the 67-year-old Perryman's South Austin home, hoping to steal his car and make a getaway. But before grabbing the keys to the actor's 1994 Geo, Tatum first grabbed an axe and struck Perryman over 10 times. When he was apprehended in the car the next day, Tatum confessed to a sheriff's deputy that it was stolen and he had slain its original owner. Actor Julian Beck, who portrays the villainous preacher Reverend Henry Kane in Poltergeist 2, passed away shortly after appearing in the film at age 60 after a 2-year battle with stomach cancer. The fact that Beck's illness developed before he ever appeared in the Poltergeist franchise hasn't done much to discourage the curse rumors. Other members of the Poltergeist ensemble have also reported strange incidents that didn't result in their untimely demise. Jo Beth Williams claims that after shooting scenes for Poltergeist, she would return home to find her own house inexplicably in disarray. In one incident, she claimed that all of the picture frames on the walls were tilted, and after she straightened them, they were all tilted once again the next day. Fortunately, no one was injured in this serial frame tilting attack. Actor Richard Lawson plays Ryan, a member of the paranormal investigation team looking into the Freelings' claims about the haunted house in the original Poltergeist. In March of 1992, Lawson was on board U.S. Air Flight 405, bound from New York to Cleveland, when it crashed shortly after liftoff from LaGuardia Airport. Fortunately, Lawson was among the survivors. He was booked in coach for the flight, but recognized by a ticket attendant while preparing to board and bumped up to first class. The move quite possibly saved his life. Of the 27 people who perished during the crash, one was in Lawson's originally assigned row of seats. Okay, that is spooky. We're just gonna go turn on some lights. The Ammons family, consisting of LaToya Ammons, her mom Rosa Campbell, and her 3 young children, moved into a rental home on a dark and stormy night in the long ago year of 2011. The home on Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana was quiet and unassuming. The family settled there in November, but began to notice strange phenomena after about a month of getting comfy. Despite Indiana winters dropping anywhere from freezing to far, far below freezing, black flies began swarming the home's screened-in front porch. No matter how many of the flies the family vanquished, more would show up shortly thereafter. The thing about flies is they live for the summer, and not like surfers. Most species of flies spend their winters underground in some form of pupal stage. They've got no business building snowmen or swarming unsuspecting ice skaters because they can't survive in the cold unless Burlington Coat Factory starts selling billions of tiny jackets. But unseasonable flies on the screen door were the least of the Ammons family worries. LaToya and Rosa began hearing noises throughout the house at all hours of the night, and a locked door between the kitchen and the basement would creak itself open while everyone was asleep. It all came to a head one evening when Campbell told investigators she woke up to see the shadow of a man pacing around her living room. Thinking it had to be a dream, she went to where he was. There was no man to be seen, but there were wet boot prints on the floor. If there ever were supernatural entities manipulating life for the Ammon family, they really kicked things up a notch on the morning of March 10th, 2012. Ammon's 12-year-old daughter was having a sleepover with a friend. When 2 a.m. rolled around, Ammons went to check on them. Campbell was called to the room where both women witnessed the unconscious 12-year-old sleeping above the covers, 5 feet above the covers. With no explanation and therefore no way to get her down, the women began praying until the 12-year-old woke up. She had no recollection of the events and was probably pretty confused as to what the commotion was about. The Ammons family reached out to law enforcement for help. But the claims were so outrageous, the authorities treated them with extreme skepticism. Oh, you too? Weird. In fact, the Indiana Department of Child Services, seeing the children's emotional distress and fearing some form of abuse was at hand, temporarily removed LaToya Ammon's children from the house. They suspected that the young children were introduced to a psychological delusion from the mother that was being reinforced by other relatives. But when case manager Valerie Washington did her due diligence and investigated the family, she found Ammons and the children healthy and of sound mind. Evidence showed that LaToya was neither hurting her children nor losing her grasp on reality. They were just the victims of unexplainable circumstances. Gary and Hammond police departments eventually returned to the home with Rosa Campbell and a representative from the Department of Child Services in the hopes of gaining their trust firsthand. And the demons were all too happy to help out. According to the police captain, once the officers entered the home, all their equipment began malfunctioning. Their audio recorder picked up a voice speaking to them, while all photos taken were adorned with weird white and green shapes resembling faces and figures. Then something seemed to follow Gary Police Captain Charles Austin home, tampering with his car and garage door. And with no way to cuff this mysterious mischief maker, Austin was unable to make any arrests. Desperate for help, the Ammons family turned to the church to rid them of this meddlesome haunting. So church officials instructed them to clean their home from top to bottom with bleach and ammonia. When that was done, they used oil to draw crosses on every door and window in the house. If it didn't get rid of the demons, at least it would smell great. An altar was also built in the basement, where the family would recite scripture every night before bed to fight off the bad vibes. Around April 20th, 2012, a hospital chaplain heard of the Ammons family's plight and was actually familiar with the symptoms. He called up his friend, Reverend Michael Maginot of Maryville, Indiana, and asked if he would perform an exorcism on Ammon's 9-year-old son. Once natural causes of the phenomenon were ruled out, Maginot concluded that the Carolina Street home was absolutely lousy with demons. This determination came after witnessing lights flickering on and off by themselves, window blinds moving without any draft, and the wet boot prints from an earlier encounter with a spectral being. Maginot blessed the home with holy water whilst reading from the Bible and offered one piece of advice to the family before finishing up: leave. Desperate for answers and running out of options, LaToya Ammons decided it was time to get otherworldly. She reached out to 2 clairvoyants who claimed her house was allegedly host to more than 200 demons actively possessing the area. That's like a plumber telling you there are 40 pairs of socks stuck in your pipes. Their advice was even less pleasant. Move out yesterday. But money was tight, and the Ammons family couldn't afford the price of packing up and shipping off. Instead, they burnt sage and sulfur throughout the house and built their own religious artifacts to pray away the demons. And it seemed to work. Things were blissfully quiet in the small home on Carolina Street for about 3 days. Then the demons came roaring back. Maybe someone should ask them to move out. Despite their efforts in quelling the hostile demons with altars and sage, the demonic activity only got stronger.
And what's worse, Ammon's 3 kids began to physically manifest signs of demonic possession.
Bulging eyes, evil smiles, deep guttural voices, the kids had it all. LaToya's middle child began describing what it was like to die, while her youngest son started speaking to a spirit only he could see. LaToya herself, while sometimes feeling weak and lightheaded, never experienced any of this, but claims it was due to her being born protected. Eventually, the spirits possessing the home decided no more Mr. Nice demons and started physically attacking the children. LaToya's youngest was thrown from the bathroom by an invisible force. Additionally, her daughter received a nasty cut when a headboard inexplicably slammed into her. The child later revealed she felt an invisible presence trying to throttle her, telling her she would die soon. The Ammons family wasn't even safe leaving the home because the force that was haunting them seemed to follow them everywhere. One trip to a physician on April 19, 2012 turned especially ominous. Several witnesses viewed the family's haunting firsthand. Ammons' sons began cursing the doctor in deep voices. One child was even lifted and thrown into the wall without anyone in the room touching him. Anyone living, that is. The boys passed out only to wake in the hospital where the paranormal activity worsened. The youngest started growling and attacked his brother, while the older glided backward around the room like a spider on the walls, floor, and ceiling before backflipping over his grandmother, all while holding her hand. After spending several months in the horror house, the Ammons family were finally able to evacuate and moved more than 150 miles away to Indianapolis. Eventually, the nightmares and feelings of being constantly watched by a malevolent force dissipated. But the house found itself back in the spotlight in 2014 when Zach Bagans of Ghost Adventures purchased the home. He then began making a documentary about the home's storied history. Apparently, the entities inside were not fans of Ghost Adventures and refused to play along with the documentary crew.
Bagans became extremely sick, and many crew members started leaving the production, allegedly due to a series of strange phenomena. Bagans finished the documentary, released in 2018 as Demon House,
warning the audience that the film is cursed and to view at your own risk. However, the movie is readily available on streaming, so it's probably safe to watch.
Bagans then had the house torn down,
a move which irked Reverend Maginot quite a bit. According to him, tearing the home down without cleansing it only allowed the evil presence there to escape to who knows where. Maybe even someplace in your town.
The Exorcist is one of the most renowned and respected horror films ever made. However, most people don't know that the novel the film is based on was inspired by real events. William Peter Blatty based his book on the real-life trauma of a young boy who had been alternately referred to as Roland Doe, Robbie Mannheim, or just simply as R. Born to a Jesuit family living in Cottage City, Maryland, Roland was described by his former classmate and now Dr. Alvin Cage as being quiet, unpopular, and not very athletic, but that he was very studious. When pushed for details on the boy's family, Dr. Cage said that they were a standard, plain family with nothing to hide, and nothing peculiar to report. Some reports say that Roland's mother and grandmother were overbearing. Others position his father as being emotionally absent and rarely around. However, every version of this story has one element that never changes: Roland's Aunt Tilly. A spiritualist by nature, Aunt Tilly had always been interested in Ouija boards, the afterlife, and what exists in the great beyond. During the summer of 1948, she reportedly taught young Roland how to properly use a Ouija board. Subsequently, Roland's family began to experience bizarre happenings around their home, such as strange noises, objects moving without being touched, and muffled voices talking. From there, things crescendoed, to family members claiming to hear large groups of people walking through the house, as if a battalion of soldiers were marching together. Dr. Cage is the only person outside of the family to have witnessed something during this time frame. He claims to have been spending time with Roland when the chair that Roland was sitting on started to shake, and Roland was thrown multiple feet away. The family believed that Aunt Tilly and Roland's Ouija obsession had unlocked something nefarious and otherworldly. They confronted Aunt Tilly, and soon after, she mysteriously passed away. Roland became more and more withdrawn after his beloved aunt's death. The boy's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He would shout and scream without provocation. His family found bruises, scratches, and welts all over his body. The boy's family explored all possible solutions. They took him to see medical professionals and psychiatrists, but to no avail. Eventually, out of desperation, they called upon the Catholic Church. The boy was examined by Father Hughes and Father Bober. During their encounter, it said that the boy could not take his eyes off the Bible. In the eyes of the clergy, this is a telltale sign of possession. Allegedly, during his first meeting with Father Hughes, the boy was asked, "What is your name?" He responded in Latin, "I am Legions." Upon Father Hughes' recommendation, Roland was moved to a hospital near Washington, D.C., which was run by Jesuit priests. Due to the increasing intensity of Roland's outburst, Father Hughes carried out a series of exorcisms that spanned 3 nights. For his own protection, Roland was strapped to the bed by the hospital nursing staff. But during a fit of rage, he broke free of these restraints and cut Father Hughes' arm open. According to multiple accounts, the gash ran from the priest's wrist all the way to the inside of the elbow. After this injury, Father Hughes took a step back, believing he had made a crucial mistake and that the boy's path to the dark side had been sealed. Roland's family moved him home, hoping that they could find a way to care for the child. However, matters took a turn for the worse when one night his mother discovered the word St. Louis seemingly branded into his skin. The family moved to St. Louis, Louisiana. Fearing social rebuke and out of medical options, the family turned to the church yet again. In St. Louis, Father Bishop and Father Bodern examined the boy and arrived at the conclusion that he was possessed. During his time with Roland, Father Bodern kept meticulous journal entries, which were later published in their entirety by the author Thomas B. Allen in his 1991 book, Possessed, The True Story of an Exorcism. Bodern, who began to doubt his own abilities to drive the demon out of Roland, eventually enlisted the assistance of quite a few priests, including Father Bishop and Father Halloran. They would largely assist in physically subduing the boy while Father Bodern performed the rite. Roland purportedly habitually spat at and demeaned the priests, propositioned them for sexual favors, and threatened them with acts of violence. This lasted for nearly 3 full weeks. One of the assisting priests claimed that the boy had the strength of a fully grown man. After seeing very little progress and an attempt to give his family some peace of mind, the priest decided to move Roland to another hospital. What his family did not know was that Roland was ostensibly being kept in solitary confinement. Things were looking dire, as the priests were having very little success reclaiming the boy's body and soul. As a last-ditch effort, Father Bodern suggested that he attempt to baptize the boy, as that might strengthen his connection to the church. After resisting the priest, eventually Roland was baptized and accepted the communion wafer. Witnesses say that the boy began to speak as if he was the Archangel Michael screaming, "Satan, Satan, I am Michael, and I command you to leave this body now." Ultimately, the boy was freed from his affliction and lived the rest of his life in anonymity, reportedly with no memory of what transpired whatsoever. His real identity has never been revealed. Many of the people involved in the case have since mysteriously passed away. However, Father Halloran, one of the few surviving witnesses, lent his perspective on the events during an interview with author Thomas B. Allen. Halloran claimed that many of the events sensationalized in the novel and film were not true to real life. He specifically points to the infamous vomit scene and Reagan's eerie change in voice during the possession as being artificial. Halloran does, however, stand by the assertions that there were numerous haunting events that he could not explain. He witnessed a bottle slide from a dresser across the room and felt Roland's bed tremble on multiple occasions. He also confirmed multiple times that Roland's skin was riddled with marks, however, he couldn't distinguish any words. What's most troublesome, though, was Father Halloran felt compelled to burn the infamous diary account created by Father Bishop, leaving only Father Hughes' diary as an unsubstantiated record. This action left many lingering questions that will now never be answered. Roland's terrifying ordeal has been told by multiple witnesses in diverging ways. The truth of the matter will forever be in question. While the priests believe it was certainly a demonic possession, many psychiatrists have viewed it as mental mental illness. Others believe it was a cry for attention by a grieving and lonely 13-year-old boy. Each group's summation, however, was fueled by its own confirmation bias. So what exactly happened to Roland Doe? It's been almost 70 years since these historic exorcisms, but no new evidence or credible witnesses have come forward to shed new light on this dark tale. Was it a cry for attention, or was it the call of the devil? Perhaps it was both.